Hi everyone, happy to be here. My name's Dan, co-founder of Range. As some background, we build asynchronous communication software used by the likes of Airbnb, Twitter, and Google. And over the last year, we've helped people navigate the transition to remote. And now that there's an end in sight, we're starting to help people navigate the transition to hybrid, which is the likely future. So we're excited to talk today with Sudhir and Dan about this. Sudhir, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Absolutely. Thank you, Dan. And welcome everyone to this session at Plato. I've been with Plato for about, 3 or 4 years now, and both as a mentee and a mentor. Been loving it, able to chat and network and discuss with a lot of people all across the world. I see folks here from Bangalore, Bermuda, etc. It's fantastic. My day job, I work at DoorDash, lead the data platform area, which consists of machine learning, experimentation, etc. So it's been fun there as well. But as far as today goes, super happy to have a discussion with you all and answer any questions I can about the concept of working from home or hybrid as
Cool.
we may go.
Thanks. And Jan?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jan. I'm the Vice President of Engineering at Tally, which is a startup company in San Francisco in the financial automation space. So we've built the first automated debt manager, and the goal, our mission is to make people less stressed and better off financially through technology.
Great. So to start off, I thought before we start talking about the future, it might be worth talking about our journey here. So it's about a year ago that we all abandoned our offices and went fully remote, whether we were remote or not before. So looking back at the transition, what went well for your teams and what surprised you? Sudhir, do you want to start?
Sure. Thanks, Dan. I'm trying to think back to March last year, which sounds like decades ago, but it isn't really. Yeah. The most surreal part that hit me was driving on the freeway, looking at those signs on the freeway that suggest please don't drive, be careful, etc. I was like, wow, this looks like from a set of a movie. But here we are. I think the most important thing that stands out for me is the resilience of the human race, I guess. Which we've all come through. I know it's been very challenging, but we've all come through and we figured out a way to make things happen. But at the same time, I do want to recognize that at least for the folks on this call, we are all mostly software professionals, and our profession does allows the luxury to work from home. A call out for those that do not have that luxury, that do not have that, the profession requires them to be on the ground. So that's been difficult. Talking about DoorDash, there are both kinds. There are folks like me who can take advantage of the situation, but also folks that are delivering food that do have to be on road and get in contact with people. It's not easy. I've done that as well. So yeah, in terms of surprises, I think in terms of what's worked well, we've all come through. We've hired, we've done well. We've interacted with each other. We've got conferences going, such as the one that's Plato. We've figured things out. And my hope is that we will continue to figure things out. Even when we come back to quote unquote normal, we will figure things out. Yes, it's going to be a bump, readjustment, but we'll figure it out.
And Jan, what was the transition like for Tally? What do you think went particularly well for you guys?
I think for us, it was a bit more of a scramble initially. It's a smaller company. Engineering at our company had 2 sites, but nearly every other function was in San Francisco and built a lot of culture and rituals around being in the office. So kind of staring down the transition, we had a lot of like week-to-week planning and scrambling down to, I remember distinctly spending 2 hours being like, what could be the worst thing that could happen in the next 3 weeks, and trying to plan out contingencies and thinking that I had given myself like 3 weeks of breathing room and planning, and having basically 90% of those contingencies happen in the next 3 days. So for us, we were trying to figure out, like, do we have enough VPN capacity for everyone to go fully remote? I had to send someone up to Canada to make sure like the Canadian office had enough stuff, and like the border closed like 2 days after he got back. And so there were all these like unexpected things. But on the whole, after that initial scramble, it actually worked out surprisingly well, and I think that was the refrain, especially from other functions who were really nervous about it and had been kind of conservative about it before, was actually like, hey, this can really work.
Yeah. I think it's easy to forget how like crazy things were a year ago. Like I remember going to a briefing on the forthcoming economic collapse, and like we really didn't have any idea how the world was going to unfold. But I think, yeah, as Sudhir, you said, as knowledge workers, we've been pretty lucky in our ability to make this transition. So, Jan, as the year progressed, how did Tally change how they think about work, and how did this transition affect some of your remote practices?
Well, obviously we all went super remote, and I think there's some things we clung to and some things we let go of. I think the whole company fairly quickly embraced the idea of having people in different places, not only because we were having folks internally wanting to relocate. I mean, being a young person in a small shared apartment in San Francisco is probably the worst place to ride out the pandemic. So unsurprisingly, a good chunk of our workforce really wanted to find more space, moving back in with their parents, moving back into a less expensive geo where they can have more space. So that, that happened. And as a result, as we get used to having someone in Montana that is dialing into the meetings, it becomes like, why not hire more people in Montana or like other geos? And so that happened pretty organically and pretty quickly, with like kind of the pleasant surprise of saying like, oh, there are people all over the country, and we just weren't really quite as open to that before, and now we are. I think in terms of, that was probably the biggest change. The stuff we held on to, which I still wrestle with, like we've been really clear, no matter where people relocate, we've opened it up to the US and Canada, but we've said we're working West Coast hours. For a bunch of reasons. We have some core teams that need to operate on West Coast hours, and but it's sort of, I think, a lingering hook. And I think we wrestle with that because on the one hand, it eases coordination quite a bit to know everyone's expected, 9 a.m. to kind of like 5 p.m. Pacific time to be available. But there's a challenge there that when people want more flexibility, it's tough for people in Hawaii. It's tough for people, on that East Coast.
So there, for your team, how are you all doing today? What are some of the challenges you faced the last 12 months, and also what challenges are you having today?
Absolutely. As Jan mentioned, I think we all were scrambling in the beginning and had to figure out our way through the situation. Personally, what I do like about the situation is that I could reduce my commute hours from 3 hours per day to 0.
Wow.
1.5 hour each way on the BART, and plus the car, plus walking was, not for the faint of heart, day in and day out. So that's one thing. I want to double down on what Jan said. It's about acceptance. I think the biggest thing is that the acceptance. It's now, given the fact that we are all remote, there is an acceptance that this model can work. I distinctly remember a press piece from Yahoo back in the days when Marissa Mayer sent out this, hey, nobody can work from home. It's a suspicious thing. I don't know if people are really pulling their weight working from home. But here we are, all working from home, and the economy is chugging. Dan, you pointed out that there were some concerns about the economy, but I think we're doing okay. So yeah, what were some of the things, as Jan mentioned? The early days were all about finding out, okay, how do we do recruiting? How do we do team meetings? How do we plan roadmaps? How do X, Y, and Z? And we all had to figure things out. Obviously, there were good tools in place. Without tooling such as Zoom, such as Slack, Microsoft Teams, whatever, unless those technologies were in place, this would have not been possible. If this was like a decade ago or 15 years ago, we would be in a soup. But given that the technology has advanced, and then you work at a company which has something to offer as well, I understand. So having all the technologies, I think, made the transition a bit easier for us.
Is there anything that you aren't doing now that you were doing pre-pandemic that you think we just shouldn't bring back?
So is it me or Jan?
Yeah.
I think it's open.
Yeah.
Like things that we just shouldn't do anymore that we were doing pre-pandemic.
Yeah.
My company used to fly everyone in pretty regularly. I joined my company about a month before the pandemic. So I hear them talk about the physical rituals that they had in the office, and I only dimly remember them. So it's a little hard for me to say. And in fact, actually, a third of the company has been hired in the pandemic. So I have peers that like I've never laid eyes on in like shared physical space with, right? Like I've only seen them through the monitor. I feel like we had a lot of rituals built around being together, that I wonder if, you know, I think you need a certain amount of them, but I think we probably overemphasize them, I would say. So I think that's something we would probably revisit for sure. But I don't know, the other one would be the commute, obviously.
Yeah, the commute, like 3 hours, I can't believe you did that every day. That would kill me. I think on the same vein as you, Jan, like one of the rituals I remember from my time at Google was a group of people would cluster around a beer keg with the director, and that was like a source of information flow and visibility, which did not seem particularly inclusive or open. So I think some of these rituals, which had informal information flow, it'd be nice to leave those behind. So now the vaccines are rolling out, and we're assuming there's no major variant outbreaks. It looks like we may have the opportunity to return to the office by the end of the year. Are you going back? Sudhir, like, what's your team doing?
So as far as DoorDash is concerned, I want to emphasize we don't have an official policy yet. We're still in the wait and watch mode. I know some companies have decided to go completely remote. Some others haven't. They've decided to come back to normal situation. So as far as DoorDash is concerned, we're still in the wait and watch mode, trying to see how the situation unfolds as the vaccination rolls out. I can answer from my department, the organization that I lead, Data Platform. We've made plans to be hybrid. And what that would mean for us is we did an informal survey of our organization, and it turns out that a lot of people are itching, craving to go back to work, to be in that physical location, to interact with folks. So we want to make that happen. There are various advantages to that, to being in a physical location, working with people. So that's a reality. But at the same time, as Jan mentioned, the cat is out of the bag. People are already working remote. We've hired from remote situations. It's unlikely they're going to be able to uproot their normal work life and really cut to a single location anymore. So the reality is hybrid. And at least what I want to do within my organization is figure that out. Again, it's going to be super hard to make a decision for a company the size of DoorDash, given that there are many functions, many different challenges, but one bite at a time. Start with my group and see how the hybrid situation unrolls. Still in planning stages. Happy to discuss some of the ideas that we have, but yes, still early stages of planning.
Yeah, and Jan, it sounds like you've hired a bunch of people in the last year. Presumably they aren't all in the locations you had offices, and people have moved. How are you going to approach the transition?
I think at base level, the base level is hybrid for sure. Montana wasn't hypothetical. We have actually hired people in Montana with no expectation that they come to a tele office. Our offices are in San Francisco and Vancouver. We've hired people in Quebec. We've hired people, so we're definitely going to be hybrid as a baseline. The question is whether we commit to more. I think that is a really early stage question that we wouldn't answer definitively without talking to everyone that's involved, because there's a whole bunch of expectations involved in like pushing that any further. I don't know, as a parent of young children, I know that for me, the office is actually a bit of a respite during the day. And I hear that a lot. Trying to figure out, going remote the way we've gone is so super different from someone who opts to go remote and is prepared and has the real estate and the setup and the rhythms and support to do it. It's really different from what we've done. So I think that's a pretty big decision, and we'd have to think a lot about how to support that.
I think, there was a CNN article that I bristled at last week saying that this was remote on easy mode, and I was like, did you have kids at home? So we have a 1-year-old, and this is not remote on easy mode for sure. It seems like most of the conversations we're having, many people want to go back to the office a couple of days a week, but they don't want to go back full time. And then there's obviously this set of people who have relocated and want to stay out. So it seems like there's going to be multiple hybrid models, some with people remote permanently, some with people in the office permanently, and some people with kind of more flexible schedules. And if you talk to someone like Sid from GitLab, their stance was always that if you're doing remote, you have to go all remote. It doesn't work to have this mixed mode. but the pragmatic reality is that most companies are going to be hybrid in the future. So how are we, like, as an industry, going to navigate that? So next, I'd love to talk about some of the challenges that you see in that model. Like, Sudhir, what are you worried about with this mixed mode operation?
Absolutely, and Sid from GitLab is probably right, very likely right. So it's easier to be on either side of the spectrum. It's easier to be on all local. I worked at Netflix. It's a large company, but guess what? The whole entire company was housed in 2 building blocks down in Los Gatos, California, right? And that model worked for them fantastically well, and it continues to work for them up until the pandemic. But there are companies such as GitLab, GitHub, etc., which from the get-go were remote first, and it's worked for them as well. Now, as you mentioned, Dan, I think the difficult situation will be when we get into this hybrid world, of which there are multiple models. There are folks that will want to go back to work, not all 5 days, but 2 days perhaps. And there are folks that will be remote folks that would be going home, working permanently, etc. So critical. I think what's very important to figure out is, I guess, the asynchronous communication, I think, is the most important thing to figure out. I know we've already on that path. We use a few tools such as, Zoom, Slack, Microsoft Teams, etc. But they're just tip of the iceberg. Dan, you know very well that to get the team to bond, every time a new person enters a team, it changes the culture of the team. So every time we go into a new model, it does change the culture of the team. How do we keep the culture of the team? How do we make sure that asynchronous communication happens? A few other things to figure out is that from a survey from folks that were onboarded as they were remote employees, the most difficult thing is to simply get information. Back in the days when everyone was local, you could just, turn your chair and yell at somebody, talk to somebody, get the information you need. Now it's much more difficult. So how do we have, more discoverable, centralized information, documentation? How do we onboard employees so that they feel part of the company? As somebody joins a company, the first thing on their mind is some validation. Can I do something meaty enough that gives me the feeling that I'm not an imposter, that I belong here, that I can validate myself? How can we make that easy? So those are some of the questions. I'm pretty sure there are tools and processes that we will discover and we have along the way. But yeah, we'll start there.
Do you have an example of how you're solving kind of that onboarding issue of gaining trust quickly, trust and belonging?
Yeah, absolutely. Prior to the pandemic, we had this concept called Neo Buddy. Neo Buddy is like your new buddy as you get assigned to a team. This person may not be from your team or your organization, but some person who's been experienced in the way of life at DoorDash. And this person would be assigned to you for at least 3 months, working with you, having one-on-ones, giving you the lay of the land. That's one thing. As far as, and then it's a whole bunch of best practices and structured onboarding. For example, onboarding documents that clearly outline the steps that you have to take, full-time Slack channels that you can pop in anytime and ask any questions if you were to get stuck. Yeah, various tools that we have at our disposal to use them effectively so that they all feel welcome. As far as metrics and productivity goes, it's very hard to measure the productivity if you have gained or not gained in productivity. So obviously we're looking at metrics such as mean time to issue a pull request, etc., as some ways of looking into if we are indeed progressing in terms of productivity.
Yeah, so it sounds like being more intentional is the underlying theme, being intentional about the documentation, processes, and communication channels. Jan, so your team's a bit smaller. How do you think you're going to approach the hybrid world, and what challenges do you see ahead of you?
Yeah, we're about 60 people. I think for me, similar themes. For me, constantly, the problem with, or the challenge with hybrid, I mean, I ran a hybrid org in my prior role at Twitter. And the constant challenge is to fight the gravity of in-office. right? Because that just becomes this nexus of information flow that's not documented, that's not available to anyone offline, that happens in its own world, because it's easier. Like Sudhir said, it's always easier to turn aside and talk to someone. And so that's kind of where the fundamental inequity of having some employees not be physically present lies. And in a way, I think, going back to that CNN article, I said easy mode, like this is remote on easy mode that way, which is that we are all remote by kind of like force, right? And we're all participating equally. We're all trapped by the same Zoom window or Google Meet window, right? And so we experience it equally. And in some ways, actually, there's some benefits to that. Like I'm short, but no one knows that over Zoom, right? Like everyone thinks we're the same height, whereas there's all these natural speaker dynamics of like, if you are a tall male presence with a deep voice, right? Like your weight carries in a physical conversation. But in Zoom, it's single-threaded conversation. When I'm talking, and the fact that I'm 5'2", like no one really knows here. So I think there's actually some, it's not equality, but equity about the system that we're in currently that is not true. And it's especially not true when you are one hybrid when you're the sole remote person dialing into a live conversation in a conference room. I'm sure if everyone who's done that, like that's actually kind of like, if there was a modern hell, that might be it. Like listening to two side conversations, not being able to follow them. Someone's banging their hand by the microphone and you're trying to be like, hey, I have a point to make. It's probably the worst way possible to run a meeting, frankly. And so you have to really be thoughtful about what you do in order to avoid those outcomes. And it feels really artificial. You have to kind of train people to do that, because if you don't provide any thought or guidance, that's the experience you're going to fall into. And that's what your hybrid experience is going to be. And it will be like a bad one. And the other piece that's related to onboarding that we've kind of talked about, or we've only touched upon, is one clear theme that we're hearing, especially from younger and newer employees, is the social isolation. Like that lack of being able to casually connect with their team, and like form the critical blocks really of psychological safety, like vulnerability and like connection across, is like harder, because you have to be very deliberate when you want to connect with someone. You have to say like, hey, let's hop on a Zoom, let's schedule it in 15 minutes. There isn't that, the barrier is quite high. And for instance, in our area where we have some younger employees who are newer, and who are not kind of extroverts, we've kind of seen them struggle a lot more. I mean, in the previous conversations prior to us going remote, and I've always asked people, like, how have you handled new grads? Like, people have generally answered, we just don't do them on a fully remote area, if our setup's fully remote. And so, I mean, you can see kind of why, but now if we make that decision and you want to have folks who are young and new on every dimension to your company, right, that's like an extra hurdle to think through and plan for.
Yeah, totally. When we were talking to remote companies prior to the pandemic, one of the pieces of advice was to make sure they had support structures and social structures outside of work, because you didn't have those ones from inside work. And of course, in this last year, no one has any social structures outside work, because everyone's sheltering in place. The other two things we've heard a lot of feedback on are making decisions and managing change. So people have mostly figured out, once people are going in a straight line, people can get productive and do work, but decision making and change management has been really challenging. Is that something you've experienced in the last year, and what kind of tactics have you I mean, DoorDash has gone through huge changes in the last year. What tactics have you employed to bring people along on decisions?
Absolutely, Dan. I think the bane of an engineer is a meeting, as in people hate being in meetings. The second part is the constant peppering of, hey, where are you at? What status are you at? Did you submit this? Did you, etc. Those are the two things that engineers, in my opinion, while I was a developer, hated the most. So what can we do to bring in efficiency there is the real question here. So we used to have concepts of stand-ups, for example. Now the stand-ups, the problem with stand-ups is that, yes, it has to be at a specific time. All good and fine when people were local. Not so easy when people are now all remote, but still okay if they're all on the same time zone. But as we go into multiple different time zones, that becomes a challenge. So given that situation, we still want to know exactly where people stand, as in about the status. If there are dependencies, are we good? Are we unblocked, etc.? So what are the best ways to efficiently deal with that? It's an evolving process. I don't say we've completely figured it out, but that's an area as a manager that I would like to figure it out. I want to give the luxury of as few meetings as possible to the team, while at the same time, I do not want to be the manager that constantly has to pepper people with questions of like, hey, did you complete this task? Did you update this one, etc. So how do we get there? That's top of my mind to figure out.
And Jan, as a 60-person team, my guess is that you've been adding people this last year, that you hit these scaling points more frequently, so you're constantly having to reorganize. Have you done any reorgs or team changes, and how did that go? And what do you have any tools to share or techniques to share?
We have, and actually the playbook was not that different. And possibly because I think my core axiom around any change like this is to over communicate by default already. And so we just followed the same playbook on Zoom. Like, I have a deep conviction that in the best case, you should not hear about any reorg that impacts you from a public announcement. You should hear it one-on-one with someone where you can react and process and ask questions and hear out the concerns first. And so we've, again, you have to take a little more time. You have to plan that out. You can't move quite like on a dime, but if you're making a change like this on a dime anyway, you're probably not doing it right. So in that way, that hasn't been so much of a challenge. It's been much more of the subtle social cohesion, cultural, is everyone okay? How are you doing this week? Those are the pieces that have been more challenging because they rely on, we have a formal sync to talk about it, and then you have to be willing to bring that piece up in order for us, as a manager, for me to have that information. Again, in current remote mode, everyone's operating that way. So in some sense, there's a bit of, everyone has the same interface, if you will. I think in hybrid, that's going to be extra hard because if you're around a group physically, then you are naturally much more attuned to them. Versus if you have one or two employees elsewhere, you have to work much harder to kind of do that, have that same visibility.
Yeah, I think that's going to be probably the biggest challenge is and I think you mentioned this, is this following. Humans are inherently lazy, right? And we follow the shortest path. So if there's a group of people next to us in the office, we will communicate with them more frequently than someone who's out of sight, out of mind. So do you have any plans for intentionally creating visibility or a presence for people who maybe aren't in the office?
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of things. I mean, we're in the early stages of planning. And one of my current thoughts right now, and the reason I'm tackling it now and not waiting until we have a little firmer ideas, is I think that on the basic level of information distribution, which I see a question in the Q&A about this, and so this is what I'm currently thinking about, is like there's the type of information you need to just like do your job. Like, and I'll show an example that when I arrived at Tally, we were so small that there wasn't a lot of documentation practices. I mean, there were some, but like in general, I had to ask someone what was happening in order to find out information every single time. But it was okay, right? Because we were in 2 buildings and the team was small. But as you grow your team and as you spread out, right, you need to, or I feel really strongly that you need to make that information more available asynchronously through stronger documentation practices. And these are habits that I'm really thinking about, okay, what should they be? I want to keep them simple because people are lazy. I don't want it to like be a huge burden to like enforce, right? But I want people to get in the habit of doing it now while we're still remote, so that when we make the transition to hybrid, which is going to bring so many other things are going to be happening at the same time. You can travel again, you can like, move around, right? These practices are already pretty deeply ingrained and held as like the right things to do, so that it doesn't become, oh, yet another thing I have to do to deal with hybrid. So that's been a whole bunch of things like taking notes on meetings, writing down key decisions, having public mailing lists or chat rooms where those decisions are broadcast out on a regular basis. I think the key to good asynchronous information, and again, I'm still brainstorming here, but is like a regular place where you can say like, hey, I may not have been around for that meeting or available, but I know I can look up the key decisions in this space, right? Without having to talk to anyone who is in there. I might need it if I have further context, but I can at least get the basics of it and hopefully be unblocked on my particular task that way. The second piece is that presence and social connection piece, which I think is much harder. And I think our tooling on this front is pretty rudimentary, frankly. Although, I mean, I know Range we've used at prior companies is specifically designed to help do a lot of the things like this, like help people, give them an easy way to say, hey, this is what I'm doing and how I'm feeling about it. So you can get like a touch point. And I do think that's going to be, tools like that will be key, where you have to make it easy for people to share information a little regularly for the social aspect, right? Because that's the part that is very personal and is very tuned. And then let managers have multiple ways to see that. You know, one of the design managers, for instance, at my company really likes, they use Notion, and part of how they use it, or Coda, sorry, is that they have, you know, just like an emoji like fest, like where they have like an hour, I think, a month, where everyone just like expresses how they feel in emoji, which I think my eng team would absolutely hate, actually, but the designers love. But it really gives them a sense of like, hey, this is where the team is at emotionally.
Yeah, I think so. I'm a complete nerd on this stuff, as you know, and many people here are probably familiar with the concept of psychological safety, but we don't really talk about where or how to create psychological safety. So the Daniel Coyle's theory, which I found really valuable, is that it starts with vulnerability, and vulnerability leads to trust. Trust leads to belonging, and belonging leads to psychological safety. But the big takeaway from his work that I found was that belonging has a half-life, it degrades. So you have to have these belonging cues. So when you're in the office, you're constantly renewing these belonging cues, which are like these very base instincts of like, we're all in the same team, we're all in the same tribe. So when people go to another office and they're out of sight, out of mind, the belonging degrades, and then you interact over a code review or in a meeting, and you are enemies instead of allies. So like cultivating that sense of belonging is super critical. Like, so dear, when you look at your team, like you're going to have people in the office, you're going to have people socializing and going to, you have a big org, they're going to go to the cafeteria. How are you helping, how are you thinking about renewing these belonging cues across the organization, given that your engineers don't want meetings?
Exactly. So even prior to the pandemic, we were in a distributed situation, if not the hybrid model. So what do I mean by that? There are multiple engineering offices. Even within the Bay Area, there was a San Francisco office, multiple buildings there, Mountain View, Los Angeles, Seattle, et cetera, et cetera. So it already was a reality that not all members of a particular engineering team were co-located. So given that, how do we bring in psychological togetherness? And as Jan pointed out, I think we want to differentiate between the tactical work or transactional work versus more of a strategic work, and a third bucket could essentially be about bonding, team bonding, Dan, to your point. All of these could be done in different ways. As far as the tactical thing goes, I guess the most frustrating point people find is the fact that they have to cut and paste the same information in 3 or 4 different tools for 3 or 4 different purposes. You might have seen this, right?
Yeah, go to the Jira problem,
right. Got it. There you go. Range for the range for the win. So yeah, that's one thing. So can we, if we were to solve that part, I think it takes care of the tactical, transactional nature of this situation. Now, when it comes to strategic, the real part over here is mostly long-term planning. As in our case, we do quarterly OKRs. That's when most of the planning happens as far as strategic thinking goes. If you were to bring people together, either via again, everyone together in the same sort of a webinar kind of a way, or in our case, we do have budgets to fly in people after the pandemic, of course, to fly in people to the headquarters for a planning session or an off-site session to make that strategic planning works. Because yes, it's very hard to structure something when you want to innovate, when you want to think quote unquote out of the box. It's good to have people together once in a while, and it also answers to the bonding part. Now to the third question about the team bonding, about the feeling of belonging, etc. There are various ideas out there, as many articles there are on HBR or etc. As Jan mentioned, some of them were about emojis and emoticons and ratings, etc. To be honest with you, I've tried it out in a few of my teams, and some folks like it, others don't. So we'll have to tailor to the situation and find out what works in what sort of a team setting, and just go with the flow there.
Yeah, you definitely have to find something that's authentic to your culture, and you can't just copy a practice. Like Zapier is a great company, and they're fully remote, and they have a bunch of really cool practices for staying connected, but they're tailored to their culture, and you can't just like transplant the gift party that they have and like move it to another company, because people may roll their eyes. So you have to think about what's authentic, but it also has to be intentional. The other thing I would say is that it's okay for there to be awkwardness, and like you have to break through the awkwardness to get to the other side, and that's one of the key takeaways. So Jan, one of the things you were talking about was like building these habits, and in a 60-person org, it's tricky, but it's doable to create a uniform set of habits. At Twitter, thousands of people, like you had teams in London and like across like the US. Like how do you establish these habits at scale, and do you need to does it need to be uniform, or like how do you think about those practices?
So I think about them as the information flow ones you want to be uniform, because you want someone to be able to know, here's how I get information in the most intuitive way possible, and then it's reliable and like relevant information, that it's like fresh, if you will. So one thing I carried over from Twitter is like trying to broadcast information on a heartbeat, right? So at Tally, one of the first things they did was like be like, okay, this is the end roundup, and it's a weekly roundup of like kind of what everyone's doing, and you're always going to receive it on Tuesday afternoon. You're always going to get it here, and so you can always know if you're like, hey, what's going on with that project? There's always a doc that you can and go look at, and that was quite deliberate to try to cut down on all the like, hey, who's the person, and like that. You can just look it up there. And so I think those pieces are, and the privilege of a 60-person org, frankly, is that you don't have to deal with the scale of it. Like the challenge we're facing at Twitter is like when everyone does that, you're just faced with a barrage of information, and you have to be more thoughtful about which ones are actually relevant to me. And so there's the practice of getting people to broadcast, and then there's the filtering, which is very much actually social media in general. Think about it in a funny way. Problem, yeah. Distribution problem, and then like filtering for relevance was the challenge there. And then I think the social piece you let be a little bit more custom to your spaces, because what works in SF is not going to work for London, and what works in SF is not going to work. What London is not going to work for Singapore. So that piece you let be a lot more organic that way. The challenge, and we experimented a couple different ways at Twitter, and I will say some of them I think were not a success. The time overlap really ends up becoming the challenge. Like San Francisco, London is a very challenging time overlap that is not pretty for either side, right? And the same thing for Singapore, San Francisco. And I think in my naivety, I'd had so much success with New York, San Francisco, where people were like, no, it's never going to work. And you're like, no, we'll just try it. And then it totally worked. But I was like, oh, London's just a few more hours off. And it was like, no, I think actually that was setting up both teams to be unsuccessful. I saw this blog post and I kind of wish I had gone back and taken the data on about like pull request time and how it's affected by how essentially, not geographically, but like time distributed your company is, and what that like feedback loop, like I think a lot about engineering is a practice of feedback loops, right? Like, and product development in general. So like that loop just gets really long that way. So I think the deliberate part then needs to be less about practice once you have your core pieces in place, and more about where are you going to build your dependencies within your company along the time. It just adds another dimension. Like it's kind of classic when you're thinking about how to shape an org, right? Like you have technical dependencies, you have like the product dependencies, and then this adds on this like time structure.
Yeah, it's almost like you're designing a distributed system. Like the way you're talking is almost like you design architecture, the interfaces.
I
and the channels.
Think about that a lot. I think about that. The analogies between distributed systems and org design for me are like quite yeah. And so if you nerd about psychological safety, this is what I nerd out about.
Well, my LinkedIn bio is engineering organizations, because I think of them as the same thing. So DoorDash, as you said, is big, and it sounds like your org is going to do things differently from other orgs. How are you approaching some of these habits, and are you doing manager training or team training to establish these practices that lead to effective teams? Or how are you approaching that?
Yeah, that's a good question. We do have a whole bunch of resources that we've outlined, various learning channels, various tools that we are thinking about exploring in how to effectively manage teams that are remote. Thinking of providing training to managers as well that are in this situation. Again, rather than go try for this whole company, which is going to be very, very hard, what we decided to do it is just attack it in small bites at a time.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll start off with small teams, identify 1 or 2 teams that can be successful in this hybrid model, learn from that model, and then apply it perhaps one step at a time to larger and larger organizations. That's what we're going to try to do as we head into the post-pandemic situation, hopefully soon.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, it's just what you said. Like when we're building distributed systems, we shard them. Like we can shard organizations, and I seem to remember Gore had this practice where once a factory got to a certain size, they'd build a factory next door because they looked at the Dunbar number and they wanted to keep it like the optimal number of people. So trying to have a uniform org of 3,000 people is almost like crazy talk.
Exactly.
So before we move to sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was talking about distributed systems. If you're geeking out on that subject, you want to know what it is that you're optimizing your distributed engineering organization for. If it's avoiding of single point of failure, which is what a support model organization would be, you want people across the globe just to get the coverage, if you will, right? But you're optimizing for innovation, speed of innovation, speed of thinking and getting things done. The more local the situation, the more better off you are. That's where sharding and caching comes into play, right? So yeah, you want to know your organization, what is it your organization is about, support organization versus product, feature, infra, etc., and what it is that you want to optimize for. Once you figure that out, I think it would be easier to figure out the structure of your organization and the particular hybrid model that might make sense to you.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And another reason why you can't always look at other organizations and copy them, because they're optimizing for different constraints. It's a really good point. So before we move to questions, Q&A, want to fast forward 5 years in your mind. So pandemic's way behind us. Has Pandora's box been opened, and what do you think work will look like? Do you think we'll be back to the practice before of the 3-hour commute and the 40-hour work week, or do you think things will look fundamentally different? Do you want to start, Jan?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone knows. I think there's a base level more familiarity and comfort with remote work that's going to be kind of like the baseline that we're all operating on. But I think, like all things, there's a pendulum that swings back and forth, and I think it'll like swing back. I read a really interesting article with the head of Aeron in the New York Times, where she said she's talking to Silicon Valley firms and she's talking to Wall Street, and financial firms are just like, everything's going to be back the same exactly. Like, we're going back in the office, we're planning. And in fact, I think it was Goldman who this morning announced that the summer interns are going to be expected to come to the office. Like, they're like, normal is back, right? And Silicon Valley is being like, we're never having an office again. Like, we don't need this. Like, it's going to be great. I think the reality will be people sorting out all in between there.
Yeah. What's your take, Sudha?
Yeah, predictions are hard, but I'm going to make a few predictions. Yes, it's going to be hybrid. But what model of hybrid I think is going to be, as Jan said, it's going to be a pendulum. We're going to figure things out as we go and what model works for each one of us. Other solid predictions: the San Francisco real estate market, especially the rental market, is going to go down precisely by 23% year over year. No, just kidding. So that apart, I think we can look from back. The only way to predict is to look back at history and see what worked and what did not, or what panned out, right? So I would dial back about 10 to 15 years ago, wherein there was this model of offshoring, wherein there was this thing that, hey, work will get offshore to some other countries, and some kind of, work would be remaining here in US and Silicon Valley. Well, guess what happened? Yes, there was offshoring, but we were all fine. We were all okay. The piece of the pie increased. Now there's, as far as the pandemic and the post-pandemic situation goes, the things on top of people's mind that are running companies are, what about compensation? What about equity in compensation? What about making sure that everyone gets equal opportunity to shine in this new hybrid world? Those are the kind of things that I don't think we can predict easily. Different companies have taken different stance on this subject, and I think it's something that we'll have to watch and evolve as you see.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Well, I hope that we are no longer constrained by the 5-day work week and the 9 to 5 butts and seats philosophy. That's my hope for 5 years. So thanks so much for your thoughts. Let's go to the questions. So Christina asks, my old company was hybrid pre-pandemic. Is it actually harder than full remote? Have either of you experienced a hybrid environment?
Yes, I mean, like at Twitter, I had teams that were fully co-located. I had teams that were, I don't know that I actually had a single team that was fully remote, but I had a couple that were pretty close. And then I had teams that were stretched across 2 opposite offices, like basically every combination in between, including stretched across international. So yeah, I've worked across a variety of those.
And it was harder?
I actually think the hardest is biggest time zone stretch is hard, and actually having a smaller number of people in a remote office is one of the hardest conditions due to expectation. If you're coming to an office, you have just like expectations of, I get to see people, I work, I've socialized. But if you're like the only person or one of 2 people on a team and the rest of your team is in a different office, right? You get kind of like the in your face, all the other teams in your office are like hanging out and you're not with your team. And you expect the office environment to provide some of that. So you haven't developed other mechanisms to get that social connection, et cetera, for your team. So I experienced those as the trickiest piece. The other piece that was really tricky is if your leadership team is not doing these and does not have experience with it, that the center of gravity tends to stay around the decision makers, whatever they do, no matter how many dollars you pour into distributed work support, right? If your leadership team is in one place making decisions in the co-located way, it tends to kind of like gravitate around that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, when I was at Google on Gmail, we were San Francisco, Zurich, Kirkland, and then Tokyo. And the collaboration between Kirkland and San Francisco was great. It was fine, and I actually feel like I collaborated with the Zurich, the Kirkland guys better than I did like people in the office. But the San Francisco, Zurich, and Zurich Tokyo was really challenging, and we ended up defragging the teams. So there were, to go to your point previously, that there weren't those interfaces on a daily basis between the teams.
Yeah, and I think it's tough when you're still a little small because you'll have someone amazing in London for this project and you really want him or her to have that opportunity, but then it just creates all this strain, unless they're willing to shift essentially to like a set of core overlap hours that's negotiated across the team.
Yeah.
That's what I've seen work, but it's tough on people.
So do you have anything to add?
I agree with what Jan said. Even my situation before I joined DoorDash, I was at Uber, multiple office situation. Some in San Francisco, others all over the world, including Bangalore, Hyderabad, Kyiv, Amsterdam, etc. So we were already living in that situation, which is hybrid, as in distributed teams. And to Jan's point, I think what we have to be watchful for is where is this decision being made? Who are involved in making the decision? Is it equitable? It becomes very, very hard when you cross time zones to see how to get all people together. If it is synchronous interaction, which is what a Zoom or a Google Meet session would be. So that's the other key. So once you figure out the time zone situation, the second thing is about the synchronous or the asynchronous nature of communication. That's what we'll have to figure out. And I think we will be able to do that with good process, good tooling. Anything that reduces meeting fatigue, anything that reduces Zoom fatigue, anything that encourages spreading of information as soon as you have it without having to copy and paste it in multiple format, multiple tools, etc. I think would be key to reaching efficiency here.
Cool. So next question, also from Christina. How do you enforce distributing information out to the remote folks from the people in the office?
I can take a shot again. I mean, this is something I've been actively thinking about. And so this is, again, where it's like getting good practices for your key touch point is generally meetings, right? So is there discipline of saying like you document this meeting, you document the decisions, and you make that available? Like that's kind of the core. And then there's meeting interaction. So things I've been thinking about are like putting my team through training. So each meeting has a moderator, an agenda. That agenda is in like a known URL kind of place, like a Go link or something for people to find. So you can have that without, if someone forgets to put you on an invite or whatever, you can still kind of like find that information. One thing I've been thinking about is saying, and this is easier again because we're smaller, is if anyone on your team that's participating in this meeting is remote, everyone has to do it remotely. Like we all have to dial in, even if you're in the office. Conveniently, we don't have enough conference rooms for everything, so that might support that. And then, corollary is like buy everyone some really good noise canceling headphones to deal with the noise that creates in your office situation. It's hard work, and I think you just have to again really think about these are the key things that need to be documented. I mean, you talk to folks from GitLab and they like take that to extreme, right? They're like everything is checked into GitLab, everything has a record, every meeting is recorded nearly, right? And that recording is nearly publicly accessible. So even thinking about things like that in order to put information accessibility.
Is there any advice?
I'll just piggyback on the same answer. I think making sure that information is captured in whatever shape and form it is. For example, in our case, we use Google Docs a lot. Pretty much anything and everything. The moment you utter a word, it's going to be on a Google Doc, so that other folks can comment, even at leisure, if not at the same time or around the same time. So capturing that information in the form of a video, in the form of a Google Doc, or whatever shape and form you can do that is very important. Second, it's about discoverable, making it discoverable. In any given organization, there's going to be a ton of documentation, and then it becomes very challenging to find that particular information that you're looking for. If companies try to make that easier, discovery, I think we will go a long way. And I do like Jan's points that she did make. Sometimes constraints help us win. And what I do mean by that is, regardless of what model that we're going to go, there are going to be constraints in terms of meeting rooms, in terms of space allowed available for gathering together, etc. These are all physical constraints, which would then dictate the practice that I guess Jan suggested, which is, hey, look, no meeting room, everyone is remote, even though you are physically at the same position, same location. Try it out. See how that works. But yeah, the goal is to make sure that everyone feels involved, everyone has a sense of belonging, information is available for everyone, it's captured, distributed, and discoverable.
Yeah. I think the irony for me is that a lot of these problems happen even with co-located teams. It's just that the remote amplifies them. And I remember when we were deploying Range at Twitter, that the problem that we were trying to help them with was that there was 5 teams of 5 who were feeling disconnected. So even though they're in the same office on the same floor, they didn't know what each other were doing, and that information flow had broken down. So it's kind of interesting that like if you make remote work, you make work better for everyone, and you make information more accessible and more inclusive. So last question from Jean, and it looks like we might have lost Jan.
I think you just lost my camera, so I will switch cameras.
Cool, we can still hear you. What are a few key remote practices that are even more important to lean into when offices become remote? Do you understand the question?
I understand the question. I mean, it's just different for each, like other than what we already talked about, I think it's different for each team. I think, one key one, we talked a lot about information size, so I would lean into like checking on people more. One of the key things I learned when I had a team that was not co-located with me is that I need to do a lot more work to make sure they felt the trust needed that they could escalate issues faster. And if you can't travel to do that, that's even more so. Like traveling to a remote office was a huge moment where I could understand so much more of how they saw, like what they felt constrained about. Sometimes like silly things, like this team has a bookshelf behind them that they hate. Like I can get it moved from SF. I don't need to be in London to like tell someone to move a bookcase, right? But just even seeing that that's driving them crazy, or like another team nearby them is just really loud or whatever. I think one thing I noticed is that when offices are remote, they are really hesitant to escalate things to you. And by the time they escalate to you, it's on fire. But they usually treat it like a first escalation. It feels to you like a first escalation. So you're like, oh, have you tried talking to them? And the answer is like, yes, they've been talking for months and they're about to kill each other. And so actually you need to jump directly to like, this needs a strong intervention. I think that's something that every manager learns. So accelerating that, and then again, building that in so that we have more ways to check on folks that are in different places becomes more important.
Cool. Before we close out, Sudhir, any final thoughts on that one?
Yeah, as far as leaning in on a few key remote practices while going remote or hybrid, all communication should be asynchronous. Everyone should feel that they're all part of the equation by, as Jan suggested, if you were to insist, I should say, on asynchronous communication or etc. That's good. Now, we want to understand what we want to optimize for, right? The folks that do come to the physical location, to the office, what they're trying to optimize for is camaraderie. What they're trying to optimize for sometimes in some cases is the fact that there will be free lunch, free coffee, free amenities to avail of, maybe, right? And those are the things, those are the folks we should support, I think, because they want to optimize that part, and nothing wrong with that. It's cool. But as far as communication, discussions, tactical work, strategic work, etc. is concerned, we want to make sure that even if it is hybrid, it's remote first. Optimize for the fact that people are remote, understand your team's situation in terms of it's a support organization versus a product, etc. Try to figure out how to optimize that for that, but go remote first, regardless of what else.
Cool. Well, thank you both for sharing, and I guess good luck in the coming months as we figure this out.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.